next keynote speech by Mr. Vince Molinari, CEO of Fintech TV. So he's going to present a keynote speech about Bitcoin as an emerging asset class.
Well, yeah, I wanted to start off and say thank you to Dr. Vin and the team. Really, congratulations on what I think is really becoming a bit of a great demonstration globally of what can be done, what needs to be done, and what is engineered to meet market demand based upon where we are today. Part of Fintech TV and its evolution has really been around the journey, right? And as we like to say, to demystify subjects and topics that are so important to our planet. And that does really deeply cover the world of cryptocurrency, digital assets, blockchain, and fintech broadly. And also interesting that fits so well into the launch and what BCMG is doing is the world of impact and making a difference and advancing sustainability and really appreciating the great benefits that we have and how do we make our planet a better place and advance humanity. So if I take that all back, it really has been part of my personal evolution in growth in the space where the growth of our global shows have already been generated from bringing these topics forward and how do we create education and awareness. So I try to look at any part of a new segment from a historical perspective, from a current environment set of circumstances, and really future-proof. Where can this go and what pain points, what is it solving for? So I think when we look back in history, it's a fairly typical process, although different to a degree when we talk about cryptography and digital representations. But what does it really represent? It represents the evolution of an asset class. And we've seen this across every global asset class, not only in our established markets, but our emerging markets when we look at equities, fixed income product, typically starting in some level of what was phone brokerage business for some of us who are a bit older and been through the cycles, to a bit of a hybrid where there's some levels of electronic and phone, to what becomes greater adoption in electronics. Then we see the advent of things like ECNs, crossing networks that ultimately go to high frequency algo. And we see the adoption and the volumes of transactions increasing commensurate with that electronic capability. So really what attracted me to the world of blockchain early on was looking at the technology as an evolutionary trail to create efficiency, to create symmetry of information, of course, to democratization of access and the immutability. So if we look at the journey of Bitcoin specifically, it was the early days of education and awareness and dare a lot of people say the craziness of what Satoshi may have put forth and what that really meant. And to change the paradigm, what value meant. What did value intrinsically mean? Trust. And when we embed trust in the system, that creates confidence. And we could look at the trajectory of US dollar denominated assets, look at what was the gold standard. And for many parts of Americans and certainly the world, not even understanding that the dollar was not backed by gold any longer, right? So what was the value and what is the value of the dollar really is the faith and the trust and the confidence in the government. And that goes on through Federal Reserve and treasuries of governments globally. What Bitcoin began to understand to say that we can have a decentralized network of trust. And if we believe in the trust and the confidence, there is value. And people would say, well, what's the value to Bitcoin, right? Especially in the early days. Well, I'll harken back to history. If we look at the evolutionary trail of what money is, materially different 100, 200 and years ago as it evolved from a physical component to what moved to become a paper-based piece of money, and what the compensation or the remuneration for that became was really based upon someone's willingness to accept that because they needed it. It really comes to greater understanding. So education and awareness, so important on one side, and really what becomes the innovation associated with it that creates comfort, right? And I would say, certainly in my opinion, when we look at global legislative and regulatory structures that begin to understand, when I was in my early days of advocating, it was as basic as understanding, for having people try to understand, particularly legislators and regulators, this is blockchain and this is Bitcoin. And here's what the components are and here's what it does. So that education has now begun to take hold. And I think what you see happening now is a direct correlation to education awareness that drives legislative and regulatory acceptance. And we see this on a global framework where the valuation increase begins to come with comfort and increased trust and acceptance. So when we look at the advent of, everybody loves to pick on Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, and it's the best illustration, going from just a couple of years ago, if anybody trades Bitcoin within JP Morgan, they're going to be fired in a second, to JP Morgan today talking about up to 1% allocation to Bitcoin. So what happened from just a couple of years ago to today? The comfort in understanding the power and, frankly, the importance of Bitcoin in our global financial structures. Well, what does that really mean? It means that we're now having this transition, in my opinion, from what was a retail understanding acceptance of gravitating towards Bitcoin to have an alternative payment mechanism currency to thwart against the hierarchy of the centralized structures. Well, I think we've migrated to a point of understanding that, well, maybe that's where it started. That's just not what it's about anymore. So the institutional acceptance and what has become regulatory and legislative understanding and acceptance has a direct correlation to price improvement and acceptance, and where we are, it's mid 50s or high 50s in Bitcoin today. Well, that just seems unfathomable when we were talking about this just not too long ago. What was the beginning of the global pandemic, right? That should have been, in my opinion, the use case perfect storm, no pun intended, as global uncertainty, governmental uncertainty around finances, treasury, fiscal policy, and Bitcoin traded down, right? It traded down in a time where most would say it should have increased, but yet we had gold trade down. So it wasn't necessarily, in my opinion, about Bitcoin as the safe harbor at that point. It was caught up in the global liquidity crisis, the massive uncertainty of race to liquidity, and everything went out to grab liquidity. Well, this resetting now has taught us of the emergence of what was, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 during the early days of the crisis of Bitcoin, to an advent of what is beginning to be some level of quasi-insatiable demand, where this migration to understanding, and the key is understanding the power of Bitcoin when we look at global phenomenons and what it can continue to mean when you have the likes of Tesla, or go through any of the organizations that we can all talk about, that are making it part of their corporate treasury. That is a monumental step to say, some portion of our treasury reserves, we are going to diversify to have Bitcoin. We're going to have Bitcoin because consumer, institutional, and payment demand is coming, right? To say we want to transact, we want to pay for goods and services, we want to pay for investment in Bitcoin. So, as a business use case, as good global business participants, hey, the customer, the client demands this, we need to adopt. We have a global phenomenon that many, if not all governments are utilizing their treasury as a bit of a printing press. Illustration here in the United States, just in the last 12 months, if you could imagine, prior to this last stimulus of 1.9 trillion, there's 40% more US dollars in circulation in the history of the United States just in the past 12 months. And that's before this $1.9 trillion stimulus. So what does it say? Bitcoin now becoming an acceptable practice as a financial hedge to inflation, as a hedge to portfolio asset allocation that has now moved to a present point in time that we have to think about this as an investable asset, as a part of an emerging investable asset class, and simultaneously to a payment mechanism that creates efficiency. When we talk about historic inflationary hedge of gold relative to Bitcoin, I think what we saw in the earlier days of the pandemic, that uncertainty as it has been permitted or accepted is changing, right? What is the value to a Bitcoin hedge relative to gold? And I think you're going to see continue greater adoption as the go-to hedge strategy because of its globalization. One of the things that I absolutely love about the Genesis Fund launch is the ability to embrace regulation, because the regulation and adherence to regulation, in my opinion, and in my historical perspective, has been what creates the certainty and comfort to allow institutional transition and engagement to say, as a portfolio manager, as an asset allocator, as a wealth manager with a fiduciary responsibility, I have inherent regulatory obligations that I have to adhere to. Well, when then you could put an emerging asset into that bucket, you allow for alpha capture in new ways where there is greater tradability margin. And if you adopt those strategies, many times as that alpha compression comes because of technology efficiencies, maybe spread goes down, but liquidity increases as greater adoption. Is this great innovation, right? Product creation to cater to investor demand that creates the comfort around regulation. But when you put forth a layer of insurance, man, that is really wonderful, right? That takes down the temperature and the comfort to say, if this structure is allowing for an insurance backstop or wrapper, it really typically denotes the underlying characteristics of the investment committee, the process, the quality of management team, the portfolio management approach to have an insurance company step forward like Archipelago to say, we're going to create an extra layer of comfort because we're comfortable as an insurance underwriter. Well, that speaks to true innovation. I think kudos to the entire team. And I think where the acceptance and the ability to fill Series 1 seems to have gone so overwhelmingly well. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, and congratulations, and thank you for having me on today.